Greetings from the Lower Makefield Historical Commission. Hello and welcome to you all. The Historical Commission is going to have a cultural history open house. Now, usually the Historical Commission has open houses to our historical homes in our area. The township owns 4 historical homes presently, and usually we have an open house and we invite you all in to see the history in the houses. But this season we're exploring something just a little bit different. We have a new venture to explore the history of all religious organizations in our area. Hopefully this will bring our religious leaders and residents together for thoughtful discussion. Lower Makefield Township reflects the religious tolerance from its founding fathers. Most of its first residents held deep roots in the Society of Friends, or Quakers. We invite you to share this Sunday afternoon and subsequent third Sundays in March, April, and May to discuss how different religious organizations establish themselves here in Lower Makefield Township. Today, we are very fortunate to have Dr. Helen Heinz here to speak. She is professor of history and teaches, she's an adjunct professor at Temple University, at the Philadelphia University, and St. Charles Borromeo Cemetery. Let's give a warm welcome to Helen Heinz.
Thanks, Roseanne. The idea for this I have to credit to one of our members of the Historical Commission, Karen Stile, who suggested that new pastors who had come into Lower Makefield were unaware of the history of Lower Makefield and how it had gotten to be the kind of place that we all love to live in. So I decided that, and we all decided that it would be a good idea to kind of at least address those issues. How did Lower Makefield come to be? So sadly, I have to start at an earlier period to kind of bring you up to the settlement of Lower Makefield. And so I prepared a little PowerPoint, and then at the end of the PowerPoint, I'm going to go on to a map, which I have over here, to kind of pinpoint the first settlers and what kinds of religions they represented and how they practiced their religion, and maybe moving forward, what happens next in the course of history of America, history of the colony of Pennsylvania, and certainly of the township of Lower Makefield. So if you relax, we're going to take a little voyage back, unfortunately, to the end of the 16th century and the beginning of the 17th century and look at the first settlements and the first explorers who are coming up the coast of North America. And first, we have Henry Hudson. And, of course, you think of Hendrik Hudson and realize, as you study him, that he's actually British, and he was sailing for the Dutch. And in those days, basically the city-states of Northern Europe, especially the Dutch city-states, had the power. In the European exchange, they had made a lot of money, and so they were financing and getting people to come sail for them in exploration up the coast of North America. He was looking for the Northwest Passage, and he arrived in the Delaware Bay in the early 1600s, just as Jamestown is being settled in Virginia. And claims, he sails into the Delaware Bay, and he claims the area for the Dutch, since he's sailing for the Dutch. And that is how the first settlers that actually arrive in our region are financed by the Dutch. Okay. Here's a recreation on the 400th anniversary of the Dutch exploration for the Northwest Passage. They actually recreated a ship, and here's an image of that recreation. Of course, after he sailed up the Delaware Bay, he got stuck on a little island where the Schuylkill River came out. It's a very nasty, treacherous little river if you think of the Delaware River. And he sails up, he gets stuck on a little bit of land for 3 days. He almost doesn't get out of the Delaware River. They actually rock the boat, they wait for high tide. Realizing it's not the Northwest Passage, he goes down and sails up the next entrance into the Hudson Bay, or into the Bay of New York, and again claims that for the Dutch. So Henry Hudson is the first guy that's into these areas. All right, Then we suddenly jump to Admiral Penn. It's one of the only paintings that we have of Admiral Penn. We're talking almost 75 years later, a little less than 75 years later, when we're looking at what's happened in Great Britain. The Dutch have come over. Since Holland's a small country, they didn't have a lot of colonists. And there's this very unusual alliance in the early 1630s between the Dutch and the Swedes under Gustavus Adolphus and then Queen Christina. And they actually send over settlers to settle on the Dutch colonies. A lot of Dutch settle in New Netherlands, and we hear about Peter Stuyvesant, etc., but nobody really thinks about the southern Dutch settlement, which is what they called the South River on the Delaware Bay. And the Swedes were in the process of conquering all of sort of northern Europe and northeastern Germany, what we call Germany today, but German-speaking areas, particularly Latvia and Finland and Estonia, those regions. So technically, the very first settlers into the South River colony are ethnic Finns. Who knew? But that's actually what we find. The very first settlers who come up here and settle around 1637 are ethnic Finns. Okay, so what religion would that be? Anybody think of what religion that would be? Lutheran, absolutely. It would be, it's definitely Lutheran. So the very first religion from a European congregation that comes over are Lutherans, and they actually establish a Lutheran church very early on the South River as well as in New Netherlands. So you have Lutheran ministers on the South River all the way past what was called Fort Christina for obvious reasons, and then north to Tinicum, and then into what's now South Philadelphia, a place called Wiccaco, which is where the very first church is established. By the time that you get the Quakers coming up the river in the 1680s, they've been there for over 40 years. And there's some unusual things that comes with that. Okay, so who was here actually first? What humans are in the Delaware Valley? Native Americans, obviously. And we talk about the Lenape and the Great Dying, how they're remnant people, but they're settling with these ethnic Finns who have very comparable values about things. When you come from Finland, you tend to keep your animals penned. You tend to live with them in your houses. So you actually use them as a source of heat for your houses. This was a very significant improvement over English plantations, either to the south near Jamestown or to the north near Plymouth Colony, where the British were typically people who let their animals run wild, and they would destroy Indian corn, which immediately caused friction with Native Americans. These ethnic Finns and Swedes and Dutch let their animals stay penned, and they didn't let them run loose and destroy the other crops that were growing in the fields, so they actually get along with Native Americans. The other interesting kind of commonality is the sauna, which you can think of. Lenape had sweat lodges. I mean, they had the same medicines, kind of same treatment of people. They got along. It really was an interesting and symbiotic relationship. There's almost no evidence of really hostile fighting, any kind of hostilities in these early settlements. It's really kind of interesting. So how many people are we talking? Does anybody have any idea? We're talking probably less than 400 families that would stretch between, say, the border of what is now Delaware and up to the bend in the river. So they definitely had the uppermost settlement was a Dutch fort at what is today Morrisville. So all along there, we have Finnish settlers. All right, in the great European conquests that are going on and the different battles that are happening in Europe, the Dutch ultimately lose. And around 1660, the new English king, who has just been restored to the throne, King Charles, sends his younger brother over to the colonies to conquer the Dutch, to push them out, because the English have the colonies to the south and they have the colonies to the north, and they're going to push out the Dutch. So James II comes over, literally sails into the Delaware River and pushes out the Dutch. They surrender pretty peaceably, actually. And at that point, we have Admiral Penn. Admiral Penn is the person who had helped with the restoration of the king. Okay, so why do we need to restore a king in Great Britain? It's part of history that Americans generally don't study, but if you think about the 17th century in Great Britain, you have, first of all, regicide, where they kill the king, and then they have a civil war, and you have Cromwell coming to power, and ultimately the restoration of the king, Charles II. Admiral Penn was the person who helped restore the king. So that is how there is a debt owed to the Penn family, because Charles II had been restored and helped by the admiral. He wasn't royalty, he's like minor royalty. In Great Britain, if you were a strong enough military leader, eventually you got to be royalty. So this is the admiral, and he had this son, a poor son. It was lucky that children survived in that era, and William Penn was kind of a sickly youth. Great disappointment to the dad. He didn't do well in school, and so his father sent him over to manage his Irish estates and colonies, which he had managed to acquire. And while there, Penn started listening to a group of dissenters called the Society of Friends, and became a convert to that way of thinking. And that meant that as a dissenter, he did not think that he owed any sign of respect to anyone else. Everyone had the same equal right to express their religious beliefs. That's what the Society of Friends believed. Everyone was equal under God, male, female, any age, and therefore you didn't show respect, like bowing to a king. He was no different than anyone else. All right, that's not going to play out well in court. You know what I mean? If you're going to court and you're not going to take your hat off to the king, you're not going to survive. And the admiral is embarrassed by his son. He tries everything to try to convince him to change his mind. He sends him to Paris. He gets him to go to Germany and meet his part of his family that was over there. He sends him back to Ireland. Nothing works. William Penn is determined to lead to ruin for the family. Okay, so here's Charles II. And he doesn't look like a guy who's going to be too happy about this. I mean, today we would call him a young sort of hippie, that's not going to respect what he's about. And this is an actual painting of the award to William Penn by Charles II of Pennsylvania. So Charles II is looking at a group of dissenters that are causing him a lot of trouble in Great Britain, that are trying to purify the church that he is now in charge of, and he owes a great debt to this family. The father has died, and with one sweep of the pen, he is ridding himself of two problems. He's getting rid of the debt, and he's getting rid of the Quakers, because William Penn says, I'm going to take them to Pennsylvania, and we're going to create a new kind of government. He's had time to think about it while he was sitting in jail, and he's created a new charter of government, and he's going to remove the problem from Great Britain. It's a win-win for Charles II. And here's James, the brother, who would actually come over and seize the territory. All right, here's William Penn, a little older. William Penn does come over. In Pennsylvania, we don't have a Mayflower, we have a Welcome. The Welcome is our Mayflower. So people who arrived on the Welcome with William Penn are the first settlers in Pennsylvania. And of course, he sells first to people in his Society of Friends. He offers very liberal terms, but he is a feudal lord. He owns this land outright. So he can do what he wants with titles and how he passes land on. It's kind of interesting. So when you look at Lower Makefield, you're looking at the first members of the Society of Friends who are purchasing from William Penn, and he gives them about 500 acres in long strips from the river up into the hinterlands, and he gives them a city lot, and basically for the same amount. He's building his green country town. He sends his cousin over to survey. He sends another cousin to become the first governor. William Penn is not noble. He's not nobility, but he's minor gentry, and he has lots of good connections, and he can find people pretty easily to come work on his new government. but it's based on these Quaker principles of equality for all, that everybody's opinion is valuable, and that he kind of reserves the right to argue you to death, but he's never going to raise a hand because your opinion is as valid as his opinion. Okay, so here's Benjamin West's painting of Penn's treaty with Lenape at Shackamaxon. He recognizes the fact that there are people here before him who have a different idea of land ownership. He doesn't quite get that. If you read his writings, he sort of thinks that if he pays them, they will go away. So he sheds all kinds of gifts and pays about 1,000 pounds of various gifts, cloth, metal, and weapons to the Native Americans, and they think that's great, and they're going to come back every year for some more. So that's what this is basically showing. But he does make the accommodation to, there are people here, I'm paying them for the land, now they're going to go away. And that's what this treaty painting is all about. And here's the first map of Pennsylvania. This is like a developer's map today, you know, where he plots out, here's my land, and where do you want to put your seat? Where's your little lot? If you look at this, what you can see are these long strips of land. Here's Lower Makefield right over here. These long strips of land with a little bit of riverfront and a little bit of bank of the river, and then there's a lot of woods going back. And then he lays out some prospective towns. Here's one. This is Newtown, actually. And there's he thinks about where he's going to be laying people out. He also gives big hunks of land to groups that agree to come over. And very early on, he gets a group of, we call them the Krefelders. They're sort of to the east of Holland, so sometimes, depending on the political situation, they're called Dutch, and sometimes they're called German. They're Low Dutch. It's the Germans that form Germantown, and he gives them an entire town to themselves. He allows them to open their own market. He allows them to create their own set of burgesses, and they can have a town. They're going to pay him a minimal amount of rent. Everyone else, he is still the Lord. They owe respect and fealty to him. If he needs them for anything, they should be coming to his help. But other than that, a bushel of wheat at Pennsbury once a year, that was the tax. And then you paid back in time what you purchased. Now here's a Quaker meeting house. These guys are Quakers. I might mention that he does have the issue of those Swedes and Finns that have land claims. And if you get a real good little bit of a microscope or something, and you look at the maps and you actually can see the names. William Penn issued land grants to the people who were here before. So the Swedes and the Finns that are here earlier and the Dutch all get title to the land that they're actually using. So you get people like, there's a Peter Rambo, for instance, who owns a piece of land along the Schuylkill River. And guess what? On that map, it says Peter Rambo, which is kind of interesting. And Lars Larson and Sven Svensson, they all have their little piece of land spelled out on the map. And they're still going to their church at Wacaco. But early on, Quaker meeting houses form. Penn starts one immediately in the new city of Philadelphia, and he starts one at his country house, which is Pennsbury Manor. So it starts in a village called Falsington. And before the meeting house is built, the Friends are gathering together in houses owned by people who are in the Friends group. All right, and if you see from this drawing, women are on one side and men are on the other, and there's a gallery up above. That seems to be a very typical layout. Often the two sides of the meeting house are separated. The women meet separately from the men, but this particular meeting house, you can see the women are on one side and the men are on the other. There's a standing woman who's obviously talking, but often nothing happened at Quaker meetings. Often you'd come to a Quaker meeting and you'd sit there and people would fall asleep. What are they waiting for? I mean, what is the whole point of this? This is kind of where it gets sort of interesting, because the Quakers talk about the inner light which sounds a lot, especially if you're raised in a different religion like conscience. But that's what they're waiting for. They're waiting for the spirit of the inner light to speak to them. And when the spirit speaks, they speak. So that's what's happening. This woman is experiencing the inner light that says she has to say something. Sometimes it doesn't make any sense. Sometimes it does. Perhaps it does only to one person. But she is speaking and everyone else is listening. And as these meetings go forward, sometimes they debate issues. And the debates get written down and circulated and shared with other meetings where they also will debate things. And if it becomes too difficult an issue, people are way too passionate about it. They call it a weighty issue, and then they table it. We don't discuss weighty issues. Slavery is like that for the early Society of Friends. With the exception of the German Krefelders, who I mentioned before, most Quakers feel it's too weighty an issue, and it will disrupt the meeting, therefore it's tabled. We move on to something else. But that's sort of what we're looking at for the Quakers. Okay, one of the things that Penn does is he tries to sell, remember that real estate map, he's trying to sell pieces of land. After all, he is a land developer, and he's hoping to make money off of this province. At some point, since this was payment of a debt, it better pay off. He has difficulty selling this land. It's not great land. Okay, if you were in Virginia or you were in Massachusetts isn't such great land either, but Virginia was very profitable for the first people in. It starts sort of as a military incursion. They managed to enrage the Native Americans. There's a couple of battles, but eventually they figure out that tobacco grows pretty well down there, and they create a market in Europe, and everybody buys tobacco. Pennsylvania tobacco doesn't grow so well. It does grow. If you go out to Lancaster, you'll see big fields of tobacco out there. It does grow, but it's short-leafed. It's not so strong. It's just a different taste. Didn't sell well in Europe. So what can we grow here? Not much, really. Corn, flax, some wheat. Season's pretty short. Temperate climate. Flaxseed grows very well, and we do supply a lot of flaxseed to Ireland and to Sweden and various European countries, especially after there's a flax blight in 1728. But for the most part, it's a hard sell to get people to come here. It's called the best poor man's country, and Penn does not get a lot of taxes back from people who he sold to. Here's the problem. If you're a Quaker and you're a pacifist, how do you require people to pay you? As I said, you reserve the right to argue them to death, but you really can't force them to do anything. It's kind of an interesting dilemma, and he does not make a lot of money from Pennsylvania, and he continues to have to sell more property in order to just make expenses. In fact, Penn goes home within 2 years, because he's fighting all kinds of things, including his charter. And he goes home to England and ends up being just swamped with legal issues. He was a great planner, not such a great lawyer. He actually ends up in jail. He has to pay off his daughter's dower. He has all kinds of problems, and he doesn't get back to Pennsylvania until 1701. So in the meantime, his agents are busy selling, and they're selling through northern Germany, and they're selling to other pietists, they call them, groups similar to the Quakers. So there are lots of people who have gathered together to rebel against the Catholic Church and form Lutheran-like sects. These are two. Mino Simons. Mino Simons is out of Switzerland, and he forms a group called the Mennonites. Okay, that's where it comes from. They followed the teachings of Menno Simons. It's similar to the Society of Friends. It's groups that gather together. They're pacifist. They tend to do some Bible readings, but a lot of actual works of Menno Simons, the basis of their religion. They come to Pennsylvania. Johannes Kelpius is another one. He formed a group called the Women in the Wilderness. It's an unusual group that comes to Pennsylvania just after the Germantown community gets here around 1698, and they settle in the Wissahickon Valley They're a group of males, so there's not, they don't believe in sex or reproduction, so they're going to limit their availability to the next generation, but they do attract people into this monastic life in the Wissahickon. He was a prominent scholar. Eventually, that's going to morph into something called the Ephrata community. They're going to move west into Lancaster County, the remnants of that group. But just kind of to explain to you that they're all groups of people that are coming to Pennsylvania, not just people who are members of the Society of Friends. Among them are the mainstream religions. I didn't get there yet. I'll go one more. This is his frame of government, by the way, which he was writing in prison. Lots of cross-outs. He's changing things. All right. I was going to talk a little about William and Mary, because after Charles gets the throne, his brother James takes over from Charles when Charles dies, and James marries a French woman. And they have an heir, a male heir to the throne who's going to be Catholic, and that's not going to fly in Great Britain. So the various lords in Great Britain decide to kick James out and invite a daughter of Charles, who has married William, Duke of Orange, to take over the throne. And that happens in 1689. As they take over the throne, they call in all the colonial owners. William Penn's already back in England, so they call him in, and they're asking for oaths of allegiance to them as the new rulers of Great Britain. Now, he still owns the property, and there's no way that William can seize that, but it means a long legal battle for poor William Penn while he's sitting in Great Britain. And there are people in Pennsylvania who hear of it and suddenly worry about what's going to happen to the government. So a lot of the Quakers actually go in and take over the legal ruling of counties, particularly in Lower Makefield. This particular township had been early settled by William Penn before he went back to England. So when this happens, in this township, the Quaker leaders of the Quaker meeting basically take over the legislative duties. They become the chiefs of the court. They rule everything. So for virtually about 3 or 4 years, Pennsylvania is a theocracy ruled by the Society of Friends. And it doesn't work too well because, as I said, they don't want to be aggressive. They're naturally pacifists. They don't like disputes. And as soon as things calm down and William and Mary say, yes, the charter according to William Penn is okay and we're going to keep him in power and he can keep on doing what he's doing, they let it go again. Okay, so here's what William Penn writes when he comes back to Pennsylvania. This is a new charter that he gives to the colony in 1701. I do grant and confirm unto all these freemen, planters, and adventurers. That's what he's got here, let's face it. First, you can read that. Almighty God being the only Lord of conscience, Father of lights and spirits, and the author as well as object of all divine knowledge, faith and worship, who only doth enlighten the minds and persuade and convince the understanding of people, I do hereby grant and declare that no persons or persons in this colony who shall confess and acknowledge one God, okay, shall be in any case molested or prejudiced in his or her person or estate because of their conscientious persuasion or practice, or be compelled to frequent or maintain religious worship. That's what he says. He's figured it out, that cause of such unhappiness in Europe is this religious squabbling that happens all through the 16th and 17th centuries. And we're going to remove that. We're going to take that all away in Pennsylvania. Why is he doing it? It's because by 1701, when he comes back to Pennsylvania, he realizes the Quakers are a minority. He started it well. He figured it out that they were going to be selling their land, but guess what? They have resold their land to people who are not Quakers. There are people who are taking over in this province, and if he's not careful, the Quakers are going to be pushed out. So the only way he can prevent that is to give them a charter that says everybody's equal and nobody is going to be required to do anything. He continues. This was another one. He does mention Jesus Christ, so he does kind of set the bar that then this is for serving in government. To serve this government in a capacity, you also have to acknowledge Jesus Christ. But as long as you acknowledge a God, in other words, Jews, Muslims, anyone can come and live here. In order to serve in government, you have to recognize Christ. Allegiance to the king as sovereign, and this is established, and of course at that point he still owned the lower colonies, which is Newcastle. And then he goes on further. This is like way down in the charter. He finally goes, oh, but remember what I said at the beginning. That first article, this charter, relating to liberty of conscience, that every part and clause therein, according to the true intent and meaning thereof, shall be kept and remain without any alteration, inviolably forever. I mean, he's like double stamping it. Just so in case you didn't hear me the first time, this is what I want to say. And he has to say that because he is losing control of the government. He's already set us this whole system up where there's going to be a governor, there's going to be an assembly, there's going to be representative government. That's what he was playing with in prison, and that's what that little paper is all about that was all scratched out. But basically, he'd been planning how he was going to run a government, and now he's got to let it go. But he wants to make sure that his Quakers will at least get the chance to have a shot. If you believe in a God, you may live here. This government will not force you to tithe any church or minister. 2, if you acknowledge God and Jesus Christ, you may serve in the legislature or any other government capacity. The important point, tithing. When Martin Luther nailed his proclamations on the cathedral door, what he was doing was allowing the various rulers of the state to create a national religion, and they could then seize the property of the existing churches. So anytime these national churches are created, they make all the people who live in their realm tithe to support the ministers. The king doesn't want to pay for it. So you basically have a soldiery, or you have police force that goes out and collects the taxes, and that pays for the minister, pays for their salaries, pays for their schools, and you have a system where the king doesn't have to get involved. Pennsylvania is going to be different. We're not going to do that. Okay, everything is equal. And you read the descriptions of these ministers, they're shocked. First of all, they got no support. They come over here, Kelpius and people like that who had been used to a steady income from the government come over here, and guess what? There's nothing. There's no churches. There's no money coming. They've actually got to go out and do something. They've got to gather people. They talk about it's like herding fish in the sea to find our congregations and get them back together. So the Anglicans, it's a British colony, right? So the law of the land in Great Britain was the Anglican Church. Here it's not. There is none. Because the Society of Friends, once it kept that way. We're all equal. Okay, how do they pay for the churches? The Swedes had the little chapel at Wakefield that we talked about earlier. Okay, how are they paying for that? The people who use it were tithing to that church. Does anything change for them? Well, now they could go someplace else. They don't like the minister. Nobody's going to force them to continue to tithe. It's voluntary. It's pretty interesting. It's just this little quirk. All right, so here's the Gloria Dei Church at Wakefield. The actual building that's there today was after Penn. They tore down the building that was there when Penn arrived, and they started a brickyard in Philadelphia about 1690. So those bricks and stones that make this church are from 1695. But it's one of the neatest places in Philadelphia, because if you go there, that old graveyard, that's the place that was there when William Penn came ashore. That's what it looked like. That's the lay of the land. You can see how far away the Delaware is. And they're going to have to fight the same as anyone else. Okay, so the Presbyterians are here. By 1720s, 1730s, We've got Presbyterians. Okay, this is William Tennant and Gilbert Tennant, his son. They're right over in Warminster, Warrington, that area on the Chamonix Creek, the Log College. Not only is he here, but he's actually training ministers. So there's Anglican, there's Presbyterians, there's Jews, there are Catholics, there are all kinds of people who are in this. And then, as I said, these weird pietist sects, the Dunkards, the Schwenkfelders, the Mennonites, the River Brethren. It goes on and on and on. And then here's the Anglican provost, William Smith. The Anglicans are really upset about this. They kind of want the Quakers thrown out. And they try all through the 18th century to get rid of the Quaker and this charter. But if they do that, the other religions would suffer. So they fight it all through the century. You have fight after fight after fight to prevent the Anglicans taking over in the assembly. He did it just enough. So even though the Quakers don't necessarily fight it, the Presbyterians will, and they join in gladly to fight the Anglicans. The Catholics join in. Everyone joins in to basically keep it the way that William Penn laid it out. So we have toleration, and that means competition for religion, and that puts religion in a separate area, separate from government. I said that brief experiment back in the 1690s convinced people they really didn't want the justices and the lawyers to be of one religion only, because then it didn't end well. So this is what the repercussion is. Okay, so this colony develops a religious culture constantly in competition, one with another, which is not necessarily a bad thing. 2, the residents have at least 10% more income than other colonies, if they wish. Pennsylvania is very successful. It's one of the last colonies, founded in 1681. And one of the reasons they're so successful is that the people have 10% more income, if most of them choose not to support any religion. All right, as the center of the American Revolution going forward, this example proves to the Continental delegates how religion and government can operate easily in separate spheres, and here's living proof that it works. In Pennsylvania, people like John Adams, who had never experienced these other religions, as people are killed and he goes to funerals in various sex churches, he figures it out that, this can actually work. And it's a much better place to have it separate and in competition, the same way you would have businesses in competition. And people can live freely, and guess what? All that strife that we have in New England goes away. All right. So that brings us to the First Amendment that gets written into the new Constitution. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. That's what they're talking about, forcing people to pay for religion. Not going to happen. Or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. We're not going to have anything to say about it. It's in a separate area. Okay. I'll move over to Lower Makefield here. I want to talk about a little piece of land down here on the river. You see Thomas Janney. He's one of our biggest guys. He owns this big piece of land that is now the Patterson Farm. But Thomas Janney had this piece that extended all the way down to the Delaware River too, and it has this little piece. Richard Vickers did not emigrate. When I first came to Lower Makefield, there was a nice lady who had a house down there. It's right near Makefield Park, and she asked me to do the property research for a house. So I started looking up how old this house was and researching it. And it turns out that it was owned by a man named Thomas Tunnicliffe, and he's not on this map. That's because Richard Vickers was the person who the surveyor assigned this little slot of Lower Makefield to. So what happened was Thomas Tunnicliffe had come over before the Welcome arrived. He had come over from West Jersey. And he was not a religious person. He was not part of the Society of Friends. And he had pretty much squatted on the Delaware River right about here, which is where our house was. And then I was doing some research and eventually found out that by 1798, James Tunnicliffe, his grandson, actually owned the property. And then I was doing more research, and I went back into various court records and discovered that Thomas Tunnicliffe appears in a court record in that critical period when the court was all the Society of Friends in Lower Makefield. And guess who the judge was? Thomas Janney, 1693. And the court case was about Thomas Tunnicliffe had abused Hannah Overton. You look at this map, Overton. It says it's settled in Burlington County, but guess what? By the time this court case happened, there were definitely Overtons there because Tunnicliffe had abused Overton. I wasn't sure what abused meant. That seemed a little sinister. So I read the rest of the court case, and it turns out that Thomas Janney and the court deliberated and told Tunnicliffe that he had behaved badly, and then it says at the end, and then Thomas Tunnicliffe abused the court. So you know what that meant. Okay. Friends did not like bad language. It was one of the things that was legislated against. So Tunnicliffe was convicted for then abusing the court, and Thomas Janney fined him 20 pounds, which was a lot of money, for the abuse of Hannah Overton, and 20 pounds for abusing the court. And then, here's the Quaker part, he posted the bond and paid it himself. Okay, that's why I said that basically courts with people who are part of the religion and trying to manage it, it just didn't work very well. And what happens, eventually the family, this guy did not immigrate. Their family actually went back to becoming Anglican by the time that this gets settled. This court case drags on to 1756. And finally, the vicar's claim gets extinguished because Tunnicliffe has managed to purchase the first half, and the second half gets purchased by someone else at an auction. I found the auction. I could figure out exactly what happened. And Vickers doesn't get it at all. And by then, the person who gets the money for these sales is an Anglican bishop. How ironic is that? But it kind of shows you what's happening in Lower Makefield. You have mostly Quakers, mostly from the western part of England. You've got from Yorkshire and from Macclesfield, Cheshire, Staffordshire, and they're all in the Society of Friends. They met locally in houses, particularly in the records. We have one with Thomas Huff. And Richard Huff's house right here on Moyer Road was the local meeting instead of going down to Falsington, which would have been a day's voyage if you think about it. Right in Lower Makefield on Main Street in Yardley, there's a little cemetery right here by the train crossing, and that's the old Slate Hill Cemetery, which the township now owns. Early Quakers did not mark their graves. It was a sign of vanity. William Penn was buried in an unmarked grave. So the front of that graveyard is all bare. But we know that William Yardley is in Slate Hill Cemetery because his will says so. So we know that most of the early settlers of Lower Makefield are probably in the first 50 feet of that old graveyard where there aren't any stones. It's kind of neat. Okay, any questions? I'm going to pass the microphone if you guys want to ask some questions. Go ahead.
When Penn came here and he found a group of people who were the Quakers, where did the Quakers come from? What did they evolve from?
The Quakers have been meeting since about 1660. It's a good question. Quakers have been meeting since about 1660. It starts in Ireland, actually, and then spreads over to areas of west and north in England. So they were a banned religion. They were not supposed to be meeting because they were disruptive. They didn't believe in, they would not take oaths, they would not serve on juries, they would not basically obey the king's laws. So Their meetings were banned. And when he agrees to remove the whole group to Pennsylvania, Charles is happy because they're all going to be leaving England as far as he can see. And these are not wealthy people. These are middle-class people. But that individualism, that idea that this person is as good as the next person, coming over to America and then having a little bit of extra income makes them absolutely amazing traders and manufacturers, and they experiment with things. A lot of them are weavers when they come over. If you look at some of these settlers here and you look at their estates, Thomas Janney had like 20 sheep. And his grandson is a wheelwright who lives right here at the corner in what's now Edgewood Village. So they get into these little minor manufactories, and they do middle-class stuff that then trades in the North Atlantic market. It's really kind of an interesting. They do things that are against the laws in Britain. They send out people and figure out that there's iron mine that's up in those hills, and we can start making iron, and then we can actually start finishing iron, which is against the laws for the Board of Trade. You're supposed to send the ore back to England, have them finish it, and then you're supposed to buy it. Well, these guys are going to cut out that whole passage, and the Quakers are happy to do that. Does that answer your question? So they meet weekly in these little groups and just meet.
All right, so Penn found them, not founded them, but he found them when he came here, and he was he joined their lifestyle.
No, he did that in England and in Ireland, and then he brings them with him. So his little group comes with him. But other people come as well because he's got this land to sell. He was given all of the western side of the Delaware River. So he takes that and he encourages all his Quakers to come. He's going to give them land outright. But to other people, he's going to sell land and then retain ownership by either a monthly or a yearly tax on the land. He actually maintains in his deed ownership of everything. It's like a land rent that you pay a certain amount back to William Penn. Eventually that gets extinguished because the family can't collect it. Since they're Quakers, there's no way to force people to pay. And he doesn't believe in military, so he doesn't set up any kind of militia or police force or anything. So it's kind of failure in a way. I mean, he's an idealist, and he doesn't set up a government that's actually practical. Does that make sense?
But in spite of that, because of what you just described, that what they were able to do with all these little businesses, it made them self-sufficient. And they were much better off financially, individually, than the other colonies that depended on one crop, for instance.
Oh, absolutely. You're absolutely right. And Pennsylvania is by far the most profitable and the most populated of the colonies, which is why it becomes the center of the American Revolution. Because this is the place that, yes, the best poor man's country, but that means you spread it around. Everybody does equally well, and a high tide floats all boats. You really do see everybody going up together. And it's the Anglicans are getting as rich as the Quakers, and nobody's going to kind of tell on anybody, oh, we're doing illegal stuff here, because they're all getting rich. There's an old Quaker expression, doing good by doing well. You know, I mean, that's part of it. It's a little bit of that John Winthrop vision for New England, you know, the city on the hill, and that God smiles on those who are saved. It's a little bit of that in the Quaker faith as well. You know, if you're successful, that means that you're good.
Is this jumping ahead? The French and Indian Wars, is that the first outbreak of hostilities? And also, did the Native Americans overreact, or were they just looking for their own survival?
The first recorded kind of conflict with Native Americans happens in 1737 with the Walking Purchase, it's called, and that is Penn's grandson. Sadly, Penn's children and grandchildren leave the Quaker faith and return to Anglicanism. They return, but they still keep the tolerance thing, because by then they've figured out that actually makes the province profitable. Having as many people coming is really good for land sales. So they keep that part. They themselves are Anglicans, so when they're dealing with Native Americans, they're they're definitely pushing the boundaries, and they have somebody running ahead, and they mark the path, and then they draw the angle at the wrong angle, so they take land all the way to Strasbourg as part of the walking purchase, and the Native Americans thought they would maybe get to the Poconos, and suddenly they're all the way to Strasbourg. So then there's friction. And the Native Americans solve it themselves. The Lenape are a tributary tribe to the Iroquois. So they go to the Six Nations and say, help us, help us. And the Six Nations have no time for them. They tell them, no, you've ruined it. You've lost your inheritance, your women, which is very denigrating at that point. Go west. And they tell them, leave. So the Native Americans, that was it. Then you're right. Then we're dealing with the Iroquois, because the province is pushing into Iroquois land by then. So the Lenape, not really a problem. Iroquois, big problem, because the Iroquois are playing both sides of the colonial conquest game. They're dealing with the French, and they're dealing with the British, and they're trying to make the best bargain for themselves. So they will definitely come out. And there are massacres starting around 1755 up in the Allentown region, northern Bucks County. And you have our Quaker young men kind of joining those militia groups. Pennsylvania still does not have a militia, refuses to pay for a militia, refuses to support the British troops, because the Quakers still have enough influence. But ultimately, by 1757, they get a law that passes that allows people to join a militia if they wish. So they do form one about 1757. Good question, Kenny. Roseanne has a question behind you.
Question, Helen. You had talked about Pennsylvania's taking their ore and refining it themselves rather than sending it over to England, and it was kind of illegal at the time. Was that like maybe planting the seeds of revolution pre-Boston Tea Party, or how does that relate?
It definitely put them in a strange position, when the British government starts clamping down and imposing this. People talk about they had this policy of kind of benign neglect, they call it. They aren't really interested in what's happening with the colonies until they realize that particularly Pennsylvania is making really sharp inroads into the West Indies trade. They're trading by the 1750s and 1760s into the Mediterranean and cutting out the British. They're trading to Northern Ireland, the flaxseed. They're really making great inroads into the mercantile process of Great Britain. So by then they're very upset about it, and it is part of the clampdown. And the first thing that actually hits Pennsylvania that makes people become politicized is the Stamp Act. And it's not because it was the Stamp Act. The Stamp Act itself just puts a little extra price to cards and brochures and legal documents. What it did was it sent appraisers into everyone's house. For Pennsylvania, property is king. So when you suddenly have an appraiser coming to your house and saying, how many people are living here, and how many slaves do you own, and how many horses do you have, and what's your manufacturing, people get upset. And that's what got them upset.
Isn't this somewhat of an argument against our current economic situation, which relies on outsourcing?
That we were so strong for internal? Absolutely. And when you look at the middle colonies, in that period, we had it all. We had the water power, we had, and people who were investing and investigating all new ways of using just basic technologies, wind and water and the soil itself, and coming up with really innovative solutions. People don't realize it, but during the American Revolution, Congress witnessed some man who had developed this amphibious vehicle that went into the Delaware and then ran on steam power through the streets. Crazy, but people in Pennsylvania did that. Some other guy in Delaware County had figured out that if he had metal railings and he put his cart on metal railings and actually equipped it with a steam engine, that it could haul big rocks out of his quarry really early in the first railroad. So we're really coming in. Pennsylvania, because it encouraged the middle classes that weren't part of an aristocracy in Great Britain, gets this population that's a whole cross-section of European entrepreneurial spirit. You're absolutely right. And so it's partly immigration helps. Oh, there's something we don't want to think about. But immigration really actually helps kind of refresh people. And the competition, you got to have, the fact that immigration comes in and competition makes people compete. Wow, what a concept. You know, you really start to think about how you can make something better than somebody else. But that's what Pennsylvania's all about. And Ms. Lower Makefield's all about. I mean, we immediately, one of the very first things that happens in Lower Makefield is that we develop what's called the flying machine. All it is a stagecoach that goes faster through Pennsylvania because it goes through Langhorne and over those little hills from Langhorne and doesn't go down the King's Highway and crosses at Yardley's Ferry and heads right to Maidenhead. And all of a sudden you're in Princeton. Cuts out about an hour and a half over the old stagecoach that went down the King's Highway. Lower Makefield. Okay. Other questions? Yeah. Well, the question is, did William Penn's children and grandchildren convert to the Anglican Church? His son, Springett, is as big a disappointment to William Penn as he was to his father. His son leads a profligate life and does not follow the tenets of the Society of Friends. So he's ejected. He doesn't really become Anglican. He doesn't do anything, and he dies very young. He's about 24. But his sons then definitely become Anglican. They're raised by the mother's family, so they all return to the Anglican faith. There's not a single one that stayed Quaker.
He had 2 wives, right? He was widowed.
Yeah, altogether he's 14 children. 18, yeah. Well, I know there's a lot, and there's, since some didn't live more than a few hours, it's hard to tell. But living children, he ends up with Letitia and William and John. But John is the second wife, Hannah's Cal Hill's son. And John, all the descriptions you read of John is that he was very different. He actually comes to Pennsylvania and serves as governor for a brief period. He has, quote, very Italianate manners and friends. He doesn't marry. So he's one of the kind of, there were no words in those in that time period for someone who lived a very alternative lifestyle. But basically, John was different. So it was William's children, Richard and I can't think of the other, Thomas, I think it is, that eventually get Pennsylvania.
I guess I got confused. There were children by his first wife and then his second wife. Which were which?
Guillermo's children is William Springett, they called him, and then Hannah Callhill's is John.
5 grew to adulthood out of 2 marriages.
Yep.
2 by the first, 3 by the second.
Letitia marries into royalty. It costs him a lot of money for the dowry, so a lot of difficulty. Okay. Thank you so much. I hope you hang around and ask some more questions and talk. Thank you.